I'm Jacob Halmbrun, editor of The National Interest. To my right is Paul Saunders, president of the Center. And to my left is George Beebe. Once upon a time, he was vice president of the Center, I think. I think that was his title. And now he is director, he's got a great title, lofty one, director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute. So our numbers have dwindled. Samuel Bendit will not be joining us, unfortunately. But George is going to step into the breach and kick this off by talking about drones, Ukraine, and Russia. George, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I lobbied to be called the Grand Director of Grand Strategy, but for some reason my organization rejected that. From the military point of view, the question that these Ukrainian operations raised is this something that will materially affect the course of this war on the battlefield? And does it provide hope that Ukraine can look forward to some kind of military victory, or at least holding off Russian advances for an extended period of time? And my one-sentence answer to that question is no, it does not. This war has become a war of attrition. And it's become a war of attrition because that's what Russia wants to fight. That's where it has structural advantages over Ukraine. It does not want to fight a war of maneuver. It does not want to fight a blitzkrieg type World War II style of warfare with combined arms operations focused on breaking through Ukrainian lines, identifying weaknesses, exploiting them quickly, penetrating and outflanking and enveloping the Ukrainians. If that's the kind of war that people are expecting, they're going to be disappointed and they're going to misunderstand what the Russians are doing and why. And they're also going to misjudge how you measure progress in this war. And I think a lot of that has been going on. A lot of people look at the line of contact between Russia and Ukraine and say, gee, it isn't moving very quickly or very far. We have what is essentially a stalemate. But I think that is misleading. In a war of attrition, you don't look at those front lines and say, gee, how fast are they moving to judge who's winning. You look at the ability of each side to put well-trained and well-equipped forces on the battlefield. And by those measures, Ukraine is losing. It is losing at an increasing pace, and there's very little hope that it can change the fundamentals that it is facing. Why? Many people look at the population figures and say Ukraine's got a third of Russia's population, which is bad enough. I think the actual demographic picture is far, far worse because there have been no censuses done in Ukraine since the Soviet period. So we're working from old figures dating to Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union. But Ukraine's demography has changed very substantially since then for many different reasons, only a few of which have to do with this war. But this war has made it even worse. And in addition to the battlefield losses, which I think the casualties are well over 1 million combined dead and wounded on the Ukrainian side, many, many millions have left Ukraine altogether. Most of them for Europe, a lot of them for Russia, and then other parts of the world as well. Those are people who will not return unless there is peace in Ukraine. But it also means that Ukraine is in an acute demographic crisis. Its birth rate has fallen to 0.7 or 0.8 births per family. That's down in South Korean territory, far less than what Ukraine needs even to maintain its current population. Those numbers won't get better over time. And from the point of view of putting well-equipped forces in the field, the Ukrainians, Americans, and Europeans combined are manufacturing about a third of the artillery shells annually that Russia is now producing. That's a very bad figure, one that we can't bridge that gap anytime soon. It will take years, and it's not a question of Congress allocating money. We simply lack the industrial capacity to build artillery shells at the rate that the Russians are manufacturing them right now. That matters a lot in a war of attrition. And I'm not one of those that believe that drones can make up for that in any substantial way. Drones help. The Ukrainians are manufacturing a lot of drones, but by themselves, they're not substitutes for old-fashioned artillery shells in this particular situation. But I think the most acute problem that the Ukrainians have right now is air defense. On paper, the Russians have great air superiority over Ukraine. And one of the questions that I think military analysts have had since the start of this war is, why are the Russians not exploiting that air superiority that they should have when you compare both quantitative and qualitative capabilities on the Ukrainian side? I think the answer has been the Russians look at both the AWACS patrols that the US and NATO have mounted since the beginning of this invasion, not over Ukrainian airspace, but close enough to it that we can cover Ukrainian airspace. And you look at the air defense systems, both that Ukraine had as a legacy of the Soviet era, but then we have supplemented with American and European air defense systems, and the Russians have not wanted to take the risks of exposing their air assets to potentially being shot down. But we're running out of air defense missiles. And this, again, is not a matter of will. It's not a matter of Congress allocating money to build more of these missiles. We simply lack the capacity to manufacture them fast enough to meet Ukraine's needs. The Russians are manufacturing attack missiles and glide bombs at a much faster rate than we can supply the Ukrainians. We've run out of off-the-shelf Patriot missiles to provide the Ukrainians. This is a major, major problem. Now, what have the Ukrainians done in the face of an attrition that is badly tilted structurally toward Russia? They have attempted to respond asymmetrically, to try to take advantage of weaknesses that the Russians have. Now, part of their motivation, I believe, is to sustain Western support, to encourage Europe and the United States to believe that the Ukrainians can stay in the fight, that we should not give up hope. We should at least sustain what we're providing to them, if not increase it. And I think the operation against the Russians was directed less at damaging Russia's war capabilities in the battle in Ukraine than it was generating support and sustaining enthusiasm in Washington for continuing to support the war. Now, I think there was also an aspect to this that was aimed at demonstrating to the United States that Russia will not escalate in return. And a lot of the talk in Washington since the beginning of this invasion was, we need to be careful that we don't cross red lines on the Russian side that might lead to escalation that could drag the United States into a direct military conflict with Russia. And I think the Ukrainians recognize that that is an impediment to sustaining or increasing American support. And I think they wanted to demonstrate to Washington that Ukraine can go after a particularly sensitive part of the Russian war machine, namely its nuclear triad, these strategic bombers. And the Russians would not escalate in ways that raised the prospect of direct confrontation between Washington and Moscow. In other words, I think they wanted to show the West that we're far too concerned about Russia's red lines, far too concerned about escalation. Now, this, I think, sets Paul up for a question of what comes next, what are the politics of all of this. But I am quite concerned that the Ukrainians have deliberately crossed red lines that the Russians have quite openly and transparently declared over the past year. The Russians revised their nuclear use doctrine. They revised that language in such a way that looks very much like it fits exactly the situation that developed over the past weekend. Namely, the Russians said if a non-nuclear state attacks Russia in a threatening way, with the assistance of a nuclear state, that they consider that a joint attack. They also said that if attacks like this affect Russia's nuclear capability, that again would be grounds for nuclear use. So the Ukrainians knew prior to this operation that the Russians had revised this nuclear doctrine. They mounted an operation directed against one element of Russia's nuclear triad, and they did it in such a way that they must have known that would raise suspicions in Moscow that they got either explicit support from the United States, or at least they did this with the awareness of Washington. That is, I think, a situation that is fraught with danger. Now, again, I'll let Paul comment on how this might play out. But I think it's very clear right now that the Russians are going to retaliate. I think they have almost no option but to retaliate, because failure to retaliate would send the signal that indeed Ukraine and others can cross red lines that the Russians have explicitly drawn. And the Russians will not react in ways that others find threatening in response. So I think they're going to have to retaliate, and the question becomes, what does that look like, and then what are the next steps? So I will leave it at that, and we can get into further discussion.
We can have a back and forth. And thank you, George. So I'll talk maybe a little bit about the political side, and specifically about the prospects for a peace agreement, and have they gone sort of up or down as a result of this. First, let me give a little bit my kind of general sense of the negotiations and where I think that has been headed. Then I will address where it might go, and as I'm doing that, I'll come a little bit to these points that George has raised, where the Russian response is concerned. So first of all, look, I think it's in the interest of the United States. I think it's in the interest of Ukraine. I think it's in the interest of Russia for that war to end. Unfortunately for the United States and for Ukraine and for people in Russia who might feel differently, I don't think that Vladimir Putin agrees with that view at this point. I think that the Russian president has still has a view that Russia can achieve its political objectives on the battlefield, and I'm kind of highlighting can achieve its political objectives on the battlefield. because I would agree with George. I don't think that Russia is trying to march its army to the western border of Ukraine and occupy Ukraine. Russia is trying to exhaust Ukraine and to collapse the Ukrainian government, and then to be in a position to impose the political terms that it wants to impose. You know, classic von Clausewitz, and if anybody reads that stuff, it's the Russians, actually. Secondly, another reason that haven't been so optimistic about the prospects for the peace talks is that actually Putin has invested a great deal of his personal credibility in this war and in achieving the war aims that he set out. And Russia has paid actually a pretty high price for that. It's not a war that, you know, many others in Russia might have started. I'm sure there are some others in Russia who, you know, might have been president instead of Putin who would have wanted to do this. But I expect there are many others who wouldn't have made that choice. So what I'm trying to say here is that from the perspective of many, this is kind of an optional and expensive war. And for Putin in that situation to take a peace deal that makes it look to Russian elites like the cost was a lot higher than the benefits is not going to be very attractive. Third reason that I've been fairly skeptical about all of this is just my sense of Putin and his evolving attitudes toward the United States. Putin has been in a key leadership role in Russia for 26 years as either prime minister or president. He negotiated with Bill Clinton. He negotiated with George W. Bush. He negotiated with Barack Obama. He negotiated with Trump during his first term, with Biden. Now he has Trump again. I think one of the most important lessons that Putin likely has drawn from that experience is that it's almost impossible for him actually to negotiate with the United States because from his point of view, there's some kind of internal anti-Russian element of the American political system that prevents him from getting the outcomes that he wants. And we can sort of have a debate about whether or not that's an accurate view, but I think that's the view that Putin has increasingly come to over this 26-year period. And honestly, I think that's a view that helped to contribute to the decision to start this war in the first place, because I think you know, clearly he had sort of a different plan for how it would go, and that failed. But I think he was prepared to pay a price in the U.S. Russia relationship, and for that matter, in the Russian European relationship, because I think actually he had more or less lost hope that he was really going to be able to achieve the objectives that he wanted to achieve in those relationships. And I would kind of point in this context to one thing that I find especially striking about the negotiations, which is that for almost the entire history of the U.S.-Russia relationship, every time the Russians wanted to negotiate about something important with us, they wanted a Senate-ratified treaty. They always wanted binding legal commitments from the United States. Now, Putin is negotiating with the United States, or Russia is negotiating with the United States about peace in Ukraine. And the Russian government has decided that it's prepared to accept, instead of that, a United Nations Security Council resolution in a situation in which the Iran nuclear deal rested upon a United Nations Security Council resolution that the United States walked away from. So does the Russian decision to take that position reflect some kind of revision of 25 years of their approach to the United States and to getting legal commitments for things that they think are really important, because they've decided that that's not achievable, but peace is so important to them that they're willing to sacrifice that legal commitment? Or does it reflect instead a view that actually these negotiations aren't really that likely to succeed in the first place, and perhaps under those circumstances this is a relatively easy thing to give away, since everybody knows that it'd be really hard to get something like that through the Senate anyway? So I have my doubts about the trajectory of all of that. Final point, just coming back to the strikes. In sort of a general theoretical sense, one could take the view that the main problem with the peace process so far is that Russia is too strong and Ukraine is too weak. That the Russians sort of think they can achieve their objectives on the battlefield. They don't really need to negotiate, and the Ukrainians are concerned that if they really enter into negotiations, they're going to have to give up things that they don't want to give up. So they both have an incentive to keep fighting. From that point of view, you can sort of make a case that imposing higher and higher costs on Russia, makes it sort of more likely that Russia will be willing to negotiate. And I think that was basically the foundation of the American and European approach so far. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked yet. There's a debate about why it hasn't worked yet, but it hasn't. For whatever reason. I tend to agree with George, however, that in this specific situation, first of all, I don't think the cost is material. It's high, it's embarrassing, but I don't think it's material. And secondly, I think there will be enormous pressure on Putin to retaliate. And not only because of the need to draw this red line, which is a red line in Russian nuclear doctrine. So to the extent that Russia has concerns about nuclear threats, this is sort of one of the most important forms of credibility that Russia has as a state. But also for Putin personally, politically. He's been sort of repeatedly actually embarrassed by the Ukrainians, who come up with these very inventive, creative, public, and successful, attacks that exploit sort of gaps in the way that Russia does things. And I would imagine that for many, particularly inside the Russian elite, they have to have sort of some questions about why these kinds of things keep happening. I'm not suggesting that anybody's going to do anything about that. That's an entirely separate issue. But I think that there are many people in Russia who will have questions about why these kinds of things keep happening. And in that context for Putin, I think it's also important to retaliate and draw a line. Now, what can Russia do to retaliate? And, you know, I would be very interested in George's view. I think that it should be fairly clear after 3 years that if Russia had sort of easy additional military options, that they would have already used those, actually. They don't have necessarily really good options on the front lines. That's very expensive. They could choose, as George sort of alluded to, really to unleash the Russian Air Force in a way that they haven't so far. However, you know, before the anti-aircraft interceptor missiles run out, you know, that's also probably kind of expensive. They can launch more barrages of ballistic missiles and drones at Ukrainian cities, which you know, can have powerful symbolic impact and is kind of a terror weapon that can aim to undermine Ukrainian morale. I'm less certain that it really underscores the point about the nuclear doctrine, and without sort of at all minimizing the devastation from those kinds of attacks inside Ukraine. At a certain point, it starts to look a little bit like some of the things that the United States has done in the past, where we sort of lob a few cruise missiles at someone and then we move on. So I don't see that as especially impactful. George alluded also to the option of nuclear weapons. I don't think that the Russians will use nuclear weapons in this scenario. I would never rule that kind of thing out, but I think the diplomatic cost to that would be quite high, and I have to assume that the Chinese leadership has been pretty forceful with the Russian leadership about that, because I don't think that Xi Jinping wants to be in the position of having to defend something like that to the rest of the planet. And I don't think he would, actually. And I think the Russians know that. So what kinds of things are left? The only thing that I have really been able to come up with is, does Russia still have more hypersonic missiles, and how many of them do they have? And what targets in Ukraine, you know, perhaps in Western Ukraine, which would sort of have a symbolic tit-for-tat value, kind of paralleling, you know, this Ukrainian reach into Siberia. You know, you can reach into our undefended region, we can reach into your undefended region, and look what we can destroy. And I think that does send a little bit of a message to the United States and others too. But it really hinges on what they've got left. So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I talked a little longer than I hoped to.
Can I do a
Please,
quick comment?
please.
I think.
Oh, and sorry, last one.
Mm-hmm.
On the Russian military doctrine, the Russians really like this phrase, foreign decision-making centers.
Yes.
So if they really wanted to send a message with one of these hypersonic missiles, or more than one of them, Zelensky's office, the Ministry of Defense, I would not at all rule out decisions like that.
Yeah, I agree. On that immediate question of how the Russians might retaliate, it was quite clear from President Trump's Truth Social posting that Putin made clear to him that he would retaliate. The fact that Trump phrased that the way he did strongly suggests that that retaliation is not going to be nuclear, and it's not going to involve the United States or NATO directly. So I think we can infer from that that this is going to be a retaliation directed against Ukraine. And I agree that
The defense ministry is a little risky in that context. But
well,
sorry,
I don't think that the Russians are going to be deterred from going after the defense ministry. In fact, the real question that I have is how many Oreshnik missiles do the Russians have? What happened last year in response to a not entirely dissimilar Ukrainian attack into Russian territory was not just the revised nuclear doctrine. The Russians used an Oreshnik missile without a explosive warhead. But they did in fact attack Ukrainian territory with this. And I think it was meant to be a demonstration strike. Here's what we can do. Now, what that Oreshnik missile seemed to be capable of was not just maneuvering in such a way that made it very difficult, if not impossible, for Ukrainian air defense to intercept, but also the implication of this was that it had a deep underground facility strike capability. In other words, it could make vulnerable command and control facilities that the Ukrainians have and have been using that are hardened and deep underground, which at one point in our history could only have been threatened by a nuclear strike. But the implication of Russia's Oreshnik demonstration strike was no, Russia can actually threaten those with a conventional warhead using these Oreshnik delivery vehicles. So if that is in fact true, and let's just say that's an unknown at this point, how many of those missiles do the Russians have? How many are operational? How many could they use? And I don't know that we know the answer to that question. But the nature of Russia's retaliation is likely to pivot on that question, not on the will of Putin to strike, but on sheer capability. If they lack a lot of these missiles, or they're not in condition to carry out these strikes effectively, then I think you see the kind of scenario that Paul talked about, where they go after targets they haven't really gone after in a big way. It does a little bit of damage, sends a message, but nobody is going to be shaken up by it particularly. And it, in turn, probably doesn't have much of an effect on the dynamics between Moscow and Washington regarding a potential peace deal. If the Russian retaliation is considerably more than that, and the damage done to Ukraine is considerably greater, including considerably more civilian damage, that does complicate things politically for the United States in trying to pursue some sort of settlement with the Russians. I think it narrows Trump's room for maneuver. And my guess is that Trump knows that, he's anticipating that, and that may explain why in his Truth Social post, he very quickly pivoted to, let's talk about Iran, where it looks like the prospects for reaching some sort of understanding are brighter right now than with Ukraine. Now, on this question of are the Russians interested in a deal? Are they interested in ending the war in Ukraine? I'm more optimistic than Paul is on this. I think the Russians want a deal, but they don't see the deal as primarily between them and the Ukrainians. In fact, they don't see this war as primarily between them and the Ukrainians. They think this is a long-running geopolitical tug of war between Moscow and Washington, between Russia and the United States, between Russia and the West. Do they want a deal on that tug of war? Yes, they do. They've made very clear what the terms of that deal ought to include. And there are aspects of this, such as an agreement that Ukraine will not be in NATO, and an understanding that NATO will not put forces on Ukrainian territory. I think if the Russians get that, and they don't believe that Kyiv is in any mood or has any capacity to deliver that kind of deal, but if they can get that from the United States, then I think the bilateral aspects of this war are more soluble. Not easy to solve, but the broader context within which that bilateral conflict is playing out becomes easier to sort out over time. But I don't think that's going to happen very quickly, in part because I'm not sure Washington quite grasps the kind of deal that the Russians are looking for. We're still thinking we need to broker a ceasefire between Moscow and Kyiv, which is not going to happen. The other thing I expect is that Putin may well escalate how Russia is fighting this war. And by that I mean he's never actually called it a war. He's not used that term. He's called it a special military operation. But in his reaction to the attacks from Ukraine over the weekend, he didn't focus on the strategic bomber strikes. He focused on what he called terrorist activity against Russia's transportation network, trains, bridges, etc., which did in fact inflict damage on civilians. He called those acts of terrorism. He called the government in Ukraine a terrorist organization and complained about that terrorist activity and the backing that it was getting from its supporters, whom he didn't name explicitly, but not hard to read between the lines on who he's talking about. Now, what happens if Russia starts conducting not a special military operation, but an anti-terrorist operation against the Ukrainians? Then I think you're going to see more anti-personnel strikes by the Russians directed at the Ukrainian leadership, who are now considered illegitimate and are now considered terrorists and are certainly not considered people with whom you can or should negotiate. And that does cause problems for the United States as we attempt to produce some sort of compromise settlement of this war. It makes it very difficult for us to continue to insist that this is between Kyiv and Moscow, and it makes it difficult for the United States to continue its material support to the Ukrainians in the aftermath of what the Russians are calling terrorist strikes against Russians. So I think Trump is going to be facing some fundamental questions as to what we do in our support for Ukraine. And the biggest question is intelligence support. Yep.
I think we're going to cut to some, you guys have been waiting patiently. Tom Firestone first. Oh, you didn't have a question? James first. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you to all of you here. And that was both expositions I thought were brilliant and insightful. First question is there any evidence that this strike on Russian air assets by the Ukrainians benefited in any material way or direct way from American assistance? Because the accounts I've read seem to sort of posit it as a wholly homegrown event, in the sense that they are manufacturing drones, they snuck these things in there, etc. Is there evidence of American support that contributed to this outcome?
Well, the White House has clearly denied that they had any foreknowledge or any involvement in this, and I suspect that that is true. The Ukrainians, I think, probably could have pulled this off without access to American targeting data. The aircraft that they targeted were parked openly on airstrips, and that was done to keep Russia in compliance with the terms of the New START Treaty. We do the same thing. But that enabled the Ukrainians to do this without needing access to American intelligence to do it. And it wouldn't have been the first time that they would have pulled off an operation like this without informing the United States. I think that happened with the Kursk operation last year, when the Ukrainians mounted that invasion into Russian territory. And my understanding was they did not inform the United States prior to all this. We got taken by surprise. So my guess is that this was not something that that the Trump administration had any awareness or involvement in. And my guess is that neither did the Biden administration.
And one of the aspects of the commentary surrounding this event has been to the effect that this has implications far beyond the current conflict, that somehow it exposed vulnerabilities for air assets for all kinds of players in the world. And I just wonder if you would address yourself to that larger, the question of larger implications of this, or are there any?
Well, what it poses a threat to, I think, is the approach to arms control that we have undertaken, both during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period. It was premised on degrees of transparency, such as, let's put our assets in full view of satellite reconnaissance so that each side can have confidence that everybody's in compliance with the terms of the treaties. If that approach to verification in fact makes these assets vulnerable to third parties, that's going to cause people to say, wait a minute, we need to rethink a few things here. And that, I think, has implications for how you establish strategic stability in a world where we're getting more and more nuclear capabilities that aren't simply focused between the United States and Russia. It's a more complicated world and more difficult to pull off arms control. And now we've got a blow to one of the foundations for how we've verified things. So I do think that is a potential implication.
And, I guess I would just very briefly add to that. Look, I mean, I think it has kind of important implications for the United States too, and not just for our strategic bombers or other things that we may park out in the open, but if you have a shipping container full of drones on a ship and it comes up to a port and a bunch of drones go out and blow up a fuel tank farm or a major electric power grid station or power plant, or I mean the warheads on these drones are very small. They're basically carrying like a grenade. So it needs to, you can only use it against something that's relatively easy to blow up. But there are a lot of things like that, and I was just going to say, and we have someone here who's done a lot of thinking about things like this.
The drones that we've known, and we've board gamed this for at least 5 or 6 years. It's cruise missiles coming out of the containers. The Russians have been selling these globally for 10 years. The Dutch Navy has them on their ships. It's just a container, you strap it to the ship and you can shoot. The Israelis have shot, the Ukrainians have shot, or the Iranians have shot, and it's not a grenade, it's a 1,000-pound warhead with precision. So, I mean, we've been talking about this forever, and they tasked the Air Force, can you defend it? And the answer was no.
John Evans.
Thank you. Last night on X, former General Michael Flynn put out an argument that he thought the Ukrainians could not have done this without Western support and intelligence. And he thought that somebody in the deep state might have done this without the knowledge of the political leadership. Now, most people in this room, I think, would as Paul just did, laugh it out of the room. But there are people in Russia who do believe there is some kind of, I don't know whether they use the term deep state, but I think they do. Now Flynn said he was going to come out with some more material. Did anyone else see this last night? It was on X. Yeah, and that, of course, if people in Russia believe that Trump's lying or uninformed, and that actually there's some cadre in the U.S. government that's involved here, that it seems to me that might complicate their calculus in thinking how to
I
respond.
think that's right. I am highly confident that there are going to be those in Moscow that will tell Putin exactly that the United States had to have been involved in some way in enabling Ukraine to do this sort of thing. It's been 18 months in the making. U.S. intelligence is deeply involved in Ukraine, was throughout this period. They must have at least picked up indications that this sort of planning was going on. That's what Putin will be told. Now, that's in part why I think the phone call between Trump and Putin was so important, to try to diffuse that. Because my guess is that Putin will be very suspicious, he's very distrustful, but he would have wanted to talk to Trump about this issue prior to making decisions on to what degree the United States did in fact facilitate this sort of attack. And I'm inferring from the tone of Trump's tweet and from the public statements that Putin has made, talking about terrorism but not talking about the strikes on the strategic bombers, as an indication that the notion that the United States was involved in this is probably put to rest. Maybe not forever, but my guess is that the acute danger that we were facing, that the Russians might conclude that Washington did enable this, might have passed. Doesn't mean we're out of the woods altogether. There's still prospects for escalation that could make it very difficult not to see this affect the broader U.S.-Russian relationship. But I think for right now, my guess is Putin has decided, I'm not going to act as if the United States made this happen.
And look, I would just add, I agree with George, but just to reinforce, I really don't think that the Ukrainians would have needed American help to do that. The location of the bases was known. I'm sure you could buy commercial satellite imaging that would kind of show the bombers sitting out in the open. I imagine there are a certain number of senior Ukrainian military officers who served in the Soviet military and may have even served at those bases for all we know. Just to really kind of think it through here, they reportedly used the the Russian cell phone network to operate the drones. So I think it's very believable that they did it alone.
I only wish we were that good. The Ukrainians, to be honest, are much more resourceful and innovative than our military establishment. That seems pretty clear. Randy.
Just the way I look at this is that things began to fall apart, not necessarily in terms of NATO, Ukraine entry in NATO. In terms we're looking towards a solution. It was the Ukrainian economic integration with Europe when things started to unravel. In flipping that around, currently, from what I'm hearing from Russians, is that they're very enamored of the growth in the domestic economy. We can argue whether it's defense-driven, which a lot of it is. But they're not concerned about more sanctions, that they have much more going on with the Chinese and the Indians. And I'm just curious about your reaction to that and how you see that in their calculations.
Well, I agree that the Russians are not particularly concerned that the U.S. will toughen sanctions in any way that really affects them materially. And in fact, I think those sanctions have perversely enabled the growth of Russian domestic commercial activities that they find quite appealing. And there are going to be those in Russia that will say, gee, we really don't want those sanctions taken away. But I think the unraveling was not primarily economically driven. I think the unraveling began in 1989, actually, when we were first negotiating over the reunification of Germany. But it went through several acute phases. But Putin raised the prospect of Ukrainian membership in NATO with George W. Bush in 2005, saying, don't do this. If you do, it will tear Ukraine apart. It will not be able to survive this. It had nothing to do with economics. It had to do with geopolitics and Russia's security concerns. It took another blow in 2008 in the spring in Bucharest when the NATO announced that Ukraine and Georgia would both one day be members of of NATO. And that very quickly led to a direct military confrontation in Georgia for reasons that had nothing to do with economics. Now, was Russia concerned in 2013, 2014, when it looked like the association agreement between Ukraine and the EU would lead to economic integration at the expense of Russia's own economic ties to Ukraine? I think yes, absolutely they did. And there was an assumption in Russia at that time that EU membership was the precursor to NATO membership. And I think what's interesting right now is that the Russians have, for reasons we can debate, relaxed their concerns about Ukrainian membership in the EU. In fact, they have repeatedly said they're okay with that. Now, why? I think they no longer assume that that is going to be a springboard to membership in NATO, and they will particularly be relaxed about that if they have the kind of guarantees from us that that won't happen. I think they're also less concerned that the EU can actually follow through and bring Ukraine into the Union. I think they're skeptical that that is actually going to occur because of reasons that have everything to do with what's going on inside the EU itself right now.
And if they achieve their objectives in Ukraine, actually the Europeans will not be interested in that anymore. So.
Amy McKinnon had a question.
Thank you, and thank you for that presentation. I learned a lot. It was really good. I was wondering if I could ask George to just pick up where you kind of left off before we went into the Q&A. You were saying that Trump has a lot of fundamental kind of questions about, or Trump is going to have a lot of fundamental questions about U.S. support for Ukraine. You said that intelligence actually would be one of the biggest areas. I'm wondering if you could just kind of continue your line of thinking of where you were going with that. And then on the strikes over the weekend on the strategic bombers, if there wasn't a U.S. role in this, which I agree with you, I think the Ukrainians are quite capable of pulling this off themselves. Do you see any potential that other European services may have been involved? Because I think some of them are champing at the bit to be a little bit more aggressive in this kind of realm.
Yeah, well, let me tackle the first question. I think the key question that Trump is going to have to wrestle with is intelligence support, because it is absolutely vital to the Ukrainians. They're not going to get a lot more military support from the United States. I think that's clear. Trump's not going to go to Congress and say, I need a new tranche of weapons. We don't have them. They're not on the shelves. And I think there's little prospect that Congress is, at least the House, going to say, yeah, we're going to continue to throw money at a military problem that does not have a military solution, really. So it's an intelligence support that really is going to matter for the Ukrainians, because the precision-guided weapons that we have provided them don't work if we don't provide targeting data that enables them to find and hit their targets. The Europeans don't have that data. We're the only ones that can provide it. And if we don't, then the Ukrainians are in trouble. And I'm most concerned that this would actually have a potentially fatal blow to Ukrainian morale. They're facing numbers problems. They're losing a lot of people that they can't afford to lose. But if you, on top of all that, you say, and by the way, your chief benefactor has cut off support that is vital to your ability to fight this war, you're going to be fighting it blind. You probably can't communicate very effectively because Starlink goes away. Now the Russians can jam and eavesdrop on everything that you're saying on the battlefield. And by the way, AWACS, which is one of the barriers to Russia's ability to fly over Ukrainian airspace, if that goes away, the Russians then can look at this situation and say, we now have a different military situation facing us. We're free to do things that we haven't been able to do or have been reluctant to do heretofore. And the question that I have is, in that circumstance, if that's what we do, and I think it's fairly likely that we might do that, how do the Ukrainians react? Do they say, you know what, we're just going to keep fighting? And they eventually collapse sooner or later, I think, in that kind of scenario. Or do they see the writing on the wall and say, okay, we have no choice but to make a deal? That's going to matter a lot to the prospects for a compromise settlement here. That will affect the political room for maneuver that all of the parties have in all of this.
I want to add, I'm sorry, Jacob, two things just very briefly, political considerations here. One on the Russian side. From the Russian perspective, this is probably the single most objectionable thing that's occurring, and it's what really makes the United States a party to the conflict from their point of view. So to the extent that Trump maybe gets tired of dealing with this mess and tries to pivot away from that to work on something else with Putin, like an arms control agreement or something, this remains an obstacle, actually. Secondly, domestically here in the United States, let's say it goes through the scenario that George describes. Trump pulls that support and the Ukrainians kind of keep fighting and then lose the war. Are they going to lose the war before November 2026? Okay. What consequences does that have? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just raising that question. I think that's an interesting question.
We have two final questions that I'm going to collect right now. The first one from TX and then Tom.
I think there's general agreement that the Russians are outproducing the Ukrainians substantially. The question that I'm seeing in a number of different reports is, how long can they sustain it fiscally? And that's variance on that cliff is a year from now to 3 years from now. Where do you come down on that?
I'm agnostic on that. I don't know the answer to that. What I am not agnostic about is the relative capability between Ukraine and its supporters on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. There's an old joke about the two campers that are out in a tent in the mountains, and a bear comes, and one of the campers starts putting on his shoes, and his companion says, "Why are you doing that? You can't outrun a bear." And he says, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I have to outrun you," right? And that's what the situation is with the Russians right now. How long the Russians can sustain their production in absolute terms doesn't matter. It matters, can they sustain it longer than Ukraine and the West? I think the answer to that is yes, they can.
Mr. Fires.
Thing. Now I do have a question. You did a great job explaining the military aspects of this attack, but can you talk a little more about the psychological and political aspects, particularly in the U.S.? I mean, with these situations, I always think about the historical example of the Tet Offensive, which was not particularly militarily successful, had an enormous impact on U.S. public opinion about the war in Vietnam. Do you see this having sort of a reverse effect in U.S. politics? I mean, we've talked a lot about how long will the U.S. sustain support for Ukraine. Might this change some of the views, particularly within the Republican Party, towards supporting Ukraine? Now we see them more as a winner and somebody more worthy of our support.
Well, I think it was designed to do that. And I do think it was meant much more for political and psychological effect than for material damage on the Russians. And you see that in the public reaction to this, which was basically a standing ovation here in Washington, not just from the Democrats, but from a lot of Republicans as well, who are not prepared to give up the fight, who do believe that Ukraine deserves our support, and that some kind of victory, or at least a sustainable stalemate, is a realistic thing. And I think it was meant to stoke those hopes. I think those hopes are false, quite honestly. I think the reality is that this is not a war that Ukraine and the West can sustain over the long term, that the Russians can keep going longer than the Ukrainians, that time is on Russia's side here. And although I think that this was designed to have a catalytic effect on our perceptions, and there are a lot of people in Washington that do want those hopes and have seized on this to make that case, I think the reality is otherwise in this situation.
I'm going to say something similar, but in sort of a different way. So there are always a lot of public opinion polls in the United States. You know, do you support this? Do you support that? Do you oppose this? Do you oppose that? And there are a lot of polls where people really support something or really oppose something. It almost never actually means anything, because very few people actually do the poll that says, you know, how much are you willing to pay in additional taxes, you know, in order to get that. So I'm very confident that there is kind of this wave of support, you know, inside the Beltway and to a much lesser extent outside the Beltway among people who are paying attention to this issue. But the question is, what are people willing to pay? And on that dimension, you know, that's a question that unfortunately I think our political system has been answering over and over again in the same way for actually 17 years, you know, since the issue of Ukraine being a NATO member first came up. The answer has been no, 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 no. For exactly the reason of what's it going to cost.
Well, I'd like to thank our two speakers and thank you all for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.